It all began on an ordinary morning in February 2001. Somewhere in Glasgow, Scotland, a seemingly nondescript figure sat in a darkened room, lit only by the faint blue glow of his computer monitor. The city outside was bustling, unaware of what was about to unfold behind those closed doors. A digital breach so audacious that it would shake the world's most powerful military institutions. But that was still a secret known only to Gary McKinnon, and he was about to push the boundaries of what anyone thought was possible. Gary, a 34-year-old systems administrator, had already begun what would later become the most significant cyber intrusion into U.S. government networks in history. He was no Hollywood-style master criminal, nor a hooded silhouette typing furiously into the night. He was, instead, a man driven by his own conviction, a man obsessed with uncovering the secrets hidden behind the powerful facades of the world's superpowers. This was not just hacking, it was a crusade. Gary wasn't always a hacker. He didn't grow up in the dark underbelly of the internet. He was an ordinary child with an unextraordinary life in Glasgow. The son of a beautician and an engineer, he lived a life that offered neither particular privilege nor extreme hardship. At 14, he received his first computer, a device that would change his life forever. The computer fascinated Gary, not for the usual teenage excitement of video games, but for the intricacies of the machine itself. The code, the logic, the mystery of what lay beneath the screen. It captivated him in a way that few others could understand. It wasn't long before Gary became the kind of teenager who preferred to spend his time at home, sitting at the computer, rather than being outside with friends. His isolation grew as his fascination for computers deepened. There was something exhilarating about the thought of venturing into forbidden spaces. The idea that there were places, digital places, that no one was supposed to enter, Gary later said in an interview. Well, it just got me curious. He was hooked not just by the technical challenge, but by the thrill of exploring the unseen. The story of Gary McKinnon, the man who would go on to infiltrate NASA and the U.S. Department of Defense, is not merely a tale of a crime, but of obsession and an unwavering belief in something beyond the ordinary. You see, Gary wasn't hacking for money or notoriety. In his own words, he sought truth. He wanted answers that he believed were being deliberately withheld from humanity, truths about free energy, UFO technology, and conspiracies of extraterrestrial contact. As his convictions deepened, so did his drive, transforming from a hobbyist programmer to someone who felt a responsibility to reveal secrets that, in his view, could change the world for the better. But let me take you back to that room in Glasgow, a cluttered bedroom that had become his command center. As the world outside went about its usual day, Gary was looking at something different. IP addresses that belonged to NASA and the U.S. military. He wasn't just playing a game. He was entering the most highly secured networks in existence. His heart pounded with anticipation and fear, yet he knew he couldn't stop himself. It was as if the deeper he ventured, the more he believed he was fulfilling some greater purpose. The setup was basic, almost laughably so. A standard PC, a modem connection, and a simple software tool, remotely anywhere, allowed him to scan for machines with empty administrator passwords. It was a vulnerability so mundane that it bordered on the absurd. And yet there it was, a gateway to the heart of the American military-industrial complex. The feeling that the fate of something far larger than himself rested in the hands of a man sitting in a Scottish bedroom was intoxicating. It was David against Goliath, with only a keyboard as his weapon. In one of his first successful infiltrations, Gary found himself staring at lists of sensitive military personnel and access credentials. It was exhilarating, the realization that for that moment he was inside. The U.S. Army's Military District of Washington network, containing over 2,000 computers, now seemed less like an impenetrable fortress and more like a digital maze for him to explore. Every click, every screen he accessed was another step into a forbidden world, and the sense of power was overwhelming. Yet what Gary found, he said, wasn't exactly what he was looking for. Yes, there were data logs and weapon system files, but he wanted more. He was searching for evidence, something to validate his beliefs. Gary genuinely thought that if he looked in the right places, he would find confirmation of zero-point energy technology, UFO blueprints, and hidden truths that, if uncovered, could set humanity on a different course. He scoured through endless directories, each more encrypted and secretive than the last. But his mission was always about more than data. It was about what that data represented, a hope for a future unbound by secrets. It wasn't just curiosity that drove him. It was the weight of a belief so heavy that it blurred his judgment. For Gary, this was never about personal gain. He wasn't after fame or fortune or chaos. He was seeking to pull back the curtain that, in his mind, was concealing monumental truths. The late nights turned into early mornings, the adrenaline and exhaustion mixing into a cocktail that both wore him down and lifted him up. He knew the risks, but the allure of what lay hidden behind government firewalls was too powerful to resist. But Gary's hacking spree wasn't without consequences. Each intrusion left digital fingerprints, tiny bits of evidence that would soon catch the attention of the world's most formidable military power. The very simplicity of his tools meant that he wasn't covering his tracks as meticulously as he could have, and deep down, perhaps he knew that getting caught was inevitable. After all, this was NASA and the Department of Defense, entities that didn't take kindly to trespassers, especially ones rummaging through sensitive files. As Gary tapped away on his keyboard, he wasn't just breaking into databases, he was setting off alarms. Somewhere across the Atlantic, an analyst at the U.S. Department of Defense stared at an anomaly on a screen, a strange login attempt from a location thousands of miles away. Was it just a glitch? Or was it something more sinister? This was how Gary's journey from an aspiring systems administrator to one of the world's most notorious hackers began to catch up with him. The question now was not whether he would be caught, but when and how severe the repercussions would be. Gary McKinnon had opened a door, but he was also awakening a sleeping giant. For now, he was just a whisper in the vast network of the DoD and NASA, a whisper that would soon become impossible to ignore. The more he hacked, the closer he came to the line that should never be crossed, a line that once breached would change everything. How far would Gary go? And more importantly, how far would the U.S. government go to protect its secrets from an idealist hacker sitting alone in a room across the ocean? The answers lie ahead, but they would take Gary down a road that would change his life and place him at the center of a controversy that would shake the very foundations of cybersecurity, international law, and government transparency. As he ventured deeper, Gary could feel the noose tightening, but the drive to uncover the truth kept him pressing forward, unaware of how soon the walls would close in on him. Imagine waking up each morning knowing that the world's most powerful government wants you behind bars. Picture living under a microscope where every move you make could be your last as a free person. This is the reality Gary McKinnon has faced for over 2 decades, a man whose search for truth spiraled into a prolonged fight against one of the most formidable legal forces in the world. In the quiet of his Glasgow bedroom, Gary never imagined his digital exploration would lead to an international showdown spanning decades and making headlines across the globe. It's November 2024, and Gary McKinnon is still in the United Kingdom. He hasn't been extradited, hasn't faced the American courts. Against all odds, he's managed to avoid what would have undoubtedly been the trial of the century, a battle that would pit a lone, idealistic hacker against the full might of the United States government. But this story is far from over, and the twists it has taken along the way are nothing short of breathtaking. Back in the early 2000s, Gary could never have anticipated the immense weight that would come crashing down on him. He hadn't planned on becoming an international fugitive. To him, it was all about curiosity, about answers, about an obsession that had become his driving force. But once the breach was detected, once the U.S. authorities realized someone had penetrated their most secretive networks, the game changed. It was no longer about UFOs and zero-point energy. It became a matter of national security. For that, Gary was marked. The United States, a nation that prides itself on having one of the most advanced security infrastructures in the world, had been humiliated. Their sacred digital fortresses had been infiltrated by someone they viewed as little more than an amateur computer enthusiast. The stakes had escalated from a search for truth into a battle of power, pride, and retribution. It wasn't just about Gary anymore. It was about sending a message to anyone who might dare to challenge their authority, especially someone they saw as a mere hobbyist. The word extradition became a dark cloud hanging over Gary's life, a constant specter. The British government found itself caught in the crossfire. On one side was their closest ally, demanding Gary be handed over to face justice. On the other was public sentiment, divided between those who viewed Gary as a heroic truth-seeker and those who saw him as a reckless criminal. The press called him the UFO hacker, a title that both trivialized and romanticized his actions. It was the kind of headline that blurred the lines between truth and spectacle, but for Gary, it was not a game. This was his life, teetering on the edge of freedom and imprisonment. The years following his arrest were defined by legal battles and political maneuverings. There were endless court hearings, appeals, and debates. At one point, the House of Lords rejected his appeal against extradition, effectively paving the way for him to be handed over to the U.S. prosecutors. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, and for Gary, each legal decision felt like another nail in the coffin. He would wake up every morning, knowing that today could be the day his freedom slipped away forever. Each court appearance, each ruling, was another step closer to what felt like an inevitable fate. But then, just as the darkness seemed to close in completely, an unexpected lifeline emerged. In October 2012, then Home Secretary Theresa May blocked Gary's extradition on medical grounds. It turned out that the years of uncertainty and stress had taken a massive toll on his mental health. Medical evidence showed that extradition would pose a significant risk to his well-being. The decision was met with a mixed response. Some saw it as a just reprieve for a man who sought nothing but the truth, while others saw it as an affront to justice and a failure to hold accountable a person who had dared to breach U.S. security. Gary McKinnon's story has since taken on a life of its own. To this day, debates rage about what should have happened, whether he deserved the harsh hand of American justice or whether he was rightfully protected by his homeland. For Gary, however, the nightmare has not ended. He remains in the UK unable to move forward, living under the shadow of what he did and the consequences that never quite came to fruition. He's free, but not entirely. His life is bound by the limitations that come with being a man constantly looking over his shoulder, forever questioning what the next day will bring. Make no mistake, this isn't a story of triumph. Gary's existence remains one of survival, a precarious balancing act on a tightrope stretched between two powerful forces. Beneath it all lies the unresolved tension of a battle that never had a clean ending. How did it all come to this? What drove a man like Gary to go so far that he ended up living a life of constant vigilance and fear? The climax of this story takes us back to February 2001, when Gary began his 13-month foray into the deepest corners of U.S. government networks. He wasn't just trying to hack into computers, he was challenging the notion of untouchable power. With each key he pressed, he was chipping away at the idea that these massive institutions were beyond the reach of an ordinary individual. But what he found, or perhaps what he failed to find, would shape the decisions that haunted him for the years that followed. As we peel back the layers of Gary's journey, one pressing question lingers. Was it all worth it? Could any discovery, no matter how groundbreaking or revolutionary, justify the years of uncertainty, the sleepless nights, and the relentless legal struggles that followed? We're about to step into the heart of his quest, the period when Gary, alone and unarmed, decided to take on NASA and the U.S. Department of Defense, armed only with his computer, his curiosity, and a fervent belief in hidden truths. Stay with me as we dive deeper into that pivotal time, into the day Gary McKinnon crossed the point of no return, into the night when the quiet clicking of a keyboard in a small Glasgow flat sent shockwaves across the globe, the night that changed everything. Gary may have been searching for extraterrestrial secrets, but what he uncovered was something entirely different, the sheer unrelenting force of a government determined to defend its borders, even in the digital realm. It's February 2001. A cold winter evening blankets Glasgow, and inside a small dimly lit flat Gary McKinnon sits alone. The flickering glow of his computer screen illuminates his focused expression. Tonight is not like the other nights. This isn't just a hobby anymore. This is a mission, a search for hidden truths that he believes the world deserves to know, something that has been kept from humanity for far too long. And tonight, he is ready to cross a line that can never be uncrossed, a line that will set into motion a chain of events that could change his life forever. What Gary doesn't know is that by the time dawn breaks, nothing will be the same. Gary has a plan, though calling it a plan might be an overstatement. It's more of an obsession, a journey led by instinct, fueled by curiosity, and rooted in a belief that there is something bigger behind the world's power structures. He's heard the whispers, read the conspiracy forums, and watched countless grainy videos, UFOs, free energy, zero-point technology, and he wants to know what's real. He needs to know. And that night he finds himself ready to dive into the depths of some of the most secure government systems on Earth, in search of proof. They called him Solo, an alias that reflected his solitary quest. He didn't have accomplices or elaborate tools. What he had was a keen understanding of computers, a fierce sense of purpose, and the determination to break into the kind of systems that others believed were impenetrable. His method was shockingly simple. He used a program that scanned for computers with no passwords or default settings, exploiting the vulnerabilities that shouldn't have existed, but were often overlooked by the very people tasked with safeguarding the nation. At first, it seemed almost too easy. He found unprotected systems, machines with default passwords, critical networks with no security at all. The reality of what he was doing hadn't sunk in yet. It still felt like a game, a personal experiment. But as the nights turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Gary found himself deeper and deeper, accessing servers belonging to NASA, the Department of Defense, and even the U.S. Army. Imagine sitting there, alone in a room, with access to the most sensitive files of a superpower at your fingertips. Gary was careful. He took notes, combed through endless documents, and looked for anything that matched the whispers he had heard about suppressed technologies. He even left messages on some systems, typing out, "Your security is crap." To him, it was almost a public service, a wake-up call that these systems were not as secure as they should be. The climax of Gary's journey came in March 2002. He had already infiltrated 97 computers across NASA and the Department of Defense. He had deleted critical files, causing the shutdown of the U.S. Army's military district of Washington network, impacting 2,000 computers for 24 hours. He'd wiped out weapon logs at the Earl Naval Weapons Station, taking down 300 computers and crippling munitions deliveries to the Atlantic Fleet. What had begun as a quest for answers was now having tangible, disruptive effects on military operations, and Gary knew he had gone too far. The world outside was oblivious to what was happening in the shadows. But the people behind the screens, the government workers whose job it was to maintain these systems, were beginning to realize something was terribly wrong. There was no denying it anymore. The U.S. military was under attack, not by a nation-state or a terrorist cell, but by one man sitting in a small flat thousands of miles away. The fear and panic in the offices of NASA and the Department of Defense were palpable. This wasn't just a breach, it was a violation of their sense of invincibility. Interviews with Gary later showed a man who was never fully prepared for what was coming. In his words, he was just looking for the truth, but even he started to feel the weight of his actions. "I wanted to find out if what I believed was true," he said, looking down, his voice almost a whisper. But at some point it went beyond that. I knew I was in deep trouble, but I couldn't stop myself. Gary was a multifaceted character, an ordinary man caught in an extraordinary situation. He wasn't just a hacker, he was a son, a friend, and someone who believed that he was doing the right thing. He'd grown up fascinated by technology, always the one tinkering with gadgets, always the one who saw the world differently. But the deeper he got, the more he realized that there were consequences far beyond his initial imaginings. The weight of what he was doing began to bear down on him, but he kept going, driven by the belief that what he was searching for mattered. And the public? They were torn. To some, Gary was a folk hero, a modern-day Robin Hood hacking his way into hidden truths that were being kept from the masses. To others, he was a criminal, reckless, selfish, and deserving of the full weight of American justice. The newspapers called him the man who hacked the Pentagon, and debates raged on talk shows and in op-eds. Was he a hero or a villain? Was this an act of civil disobedience, or was it an unforgivable crime? But as public fascination grew, so did the intensity of the pursuit. The United States government was not amused, and neither were the agencies that had been targeted. NASA, the Department of Defense, they were all furious, embarrassed by the vulnerability that Gary had exposed, and they wanted retribution. There was no longer any room for sympathy or understanding. This was about making an example of Gary, ensuring that no one else would dare to cross this line again. Gary himself later admitted that during those final days of his hacking spree, he could feel the noose tightening. He knew they were getting closer, that it was only a matter of time before they tracked him down. But he kept going. He kept diving into the files, searching for the proof that he believed was there, for the documents that would confirm the existence of extraterrestrial technologies, of hidden energy solutions. But time was running out. And then it happened. In March 2002, Gary logged in for what would be one of the last times. He could sense something different. The connection felt slower, less responsive, like someone was watching, waiting. He'd always imagined that if they caught him, it would be dramatic, maybe a team of agents kicking down his door, but instead it was silence. The eerie silence of knowing that the game was almost up. Have you ever been so caught up in something that you lose sight of the risks? That's what happened to Gary. He was caught in the thrill of discovery, the adrenaline of breaching the supposedly unbreachable. He knew the risks, but until that moment, they hadn't felt real. Now, with the authorities closing in, it was all too real. He was no longer a ghost in the machine. He was about to face the full weight of what he had done. As the authorities closed in, the world around Gary began to shrink. The freedom he had once felt while exploring these forbidden networks was replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. The thrill was gone, replaced by the cold, hard reality of what he had done. He had pushed too far, and now he would have to pay the price. But what do you think? Was Gary McKinnon a hero seeking the truth, or a reckless hacker who deserved to be caught? As we move forward, the story only becomes more intense, the consequences more dire. Stay with me as we unravel the pursuit that led to Gary's doorstep, and the moment he realized that his search for the truth would cost him everything. March 19th, 2002, the day everything changed for Gary McKinnon. The distant fear of being caught had suddenly become his reality. It started as an ordinary morning, but within hours, it turned into something that felt like a scene from a movie. The knock at his door was sharp, authoritative, and unmistakable. It wasn't a surprise, but the weight of that moment made Gary's heart race. He opened the door, and there they were, officers from the UK's National High-Tech Crime Unit, NHTCU, standing in the threshold of his small flat. This was it. The chase had officially begun. The request had come straight from the United States. U.S. authorities were furious, and they wanted Gary McKinnon brought to justice. For a man who had been searching for secrets hidden in the depths of NASA's and the Department of Defense's networks, Gary now found himself the subject of international attention, and it was not the kind he had hoped for. The Americans had labeled him a threat, a cybercriminal who had exposed their vulnerabilities. They were demanding action, and the UK was left with little choice but to comply. Gary's mind flashed back to the nights he spent hunched over his computer, breaking into systems with a mixture of fascination and obsession. It all seemed so distant now, a fantasy that had nothing to do with the grim reality standing at his doorstep. He had been searching for the truth, for evidence of free energy and extraterrestrial technologies, but now he was facing something far more tangible, the prospect of losing his freedom. The officers stepped inside, and Gary could feel the walls closing in around him. The interview room was cold and sterile, an environment designed to unsettle. Gary was brought in for questioning by the NHTCU on March 19, 2002. He could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken weight of what he had done. He wasn't just a man who had crossed a line. He had crossed an ocean, breached borders, and touched nerves he never fully understood. His initial interview felt like a blur. The officers questioned him about his motivations, about how he had managed to infiltrate some of the most secure systems in the world. He was candid, almost defiant. He told them he was looking for information about UFOs, about free energy, about the things he believed were being kept from the public. "Why did you do it, Gary?" one of the officers asked, his tone a mix of disbelief and frustration. Gary took a deep breath, his voice steady but laced with a sense of desperation. "I wanted to find the truth. I wanted to know if they were hiding something from us. I never intended to cause harm." But his explanations fell on skeptical ears. To the men across the table, Gary wasn't a truth seeker. He was a criminal, and he had to be treated as such. The media got wind of the story, and soon Gary's face was plastered across newspapers and television screens. The world watched as the story of the Pentagon Hacker unfolded. He became a household name, and not in the way he had ever imagined. To some, he was a hero, someone brave enough to expose the secrets of the powerful. But to others, he was reckless, a hacker who had put national security at risk. The debate raged, and Gary found himself caught in the middle, his life turned upside down by the very quest that had once given him purpose. The months that followed were a blur of uncertainty and anxiety. Gary knew the Americans wanted to extradite him, to drag him across the Atlantic and put him on trial for what they considered to be acts of cyber terrorism. He had read the reports. They were calling for a sentence of up to 70 years in prison. The thought of spending the rest of his life behind bars terrified him, and the fear gnawed at the edges of his mind. The more the story unfolded, the more Gary felt like he was losing control. He was no longer the man searching for hidden truths. He was a fugitive, a pawn in an international game of power and retribution. On August 8, 2002, Gary was summoned again. This time, the interview was even more intense. The NHTCU had more information. They had analyzed his activities, traced his steps, and pieced together the story of his hacking spree. They knew about the deleted files, the shutdowns, the chaos he had caused. The questions were relentless, and Gary felt the pressure building. Every answer he gave felt like it was being scrutinized, dissected, and twisted against him. He could see the determination in the officers' eyes. They wanted a confession, something they could use to make their case. Gary tried to explain himself, to make them understand that he wasn't a threat. He talked about his fascination with space, his belief that the government was hiding advanced technologies from the public. But the more he talked, the more he realized that they didn't care about his motivations. To them, he was nothing more than a criminal, someone who had dared to breach their systems, to challenge their authority. He could see it in their faces. There was no sympathy, no understanding, only the cold, calculated pursuit of justice. The pressure was unbearable. Gary spent sleepless nights, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. He tried to stay hopeful, to believe that somehow he could make them see that he wasn't a danger, that he was just a man searching for answers. But the reality was sinking in. The U.S. government was not going to let this go, and neither were the U.K. authorities. He was a liability, an embarrassment to the powers that be, and they were determined to make an example out of him. The fear of extradition loomed large. Gary had heard stories of what awaited him if he was handed over to the Americans. Solitary confinement, harsh prison conditions, a trial that would make an example of him to the rest of the world. He tried to push those thoughts away, to focus on the here and now, but it was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the walls of a prison cell closing in around him. He had always been a man who sought the truth, who believed in the power of knowledge, but now that same pursuit had led him to the brink of losing everything. And then it all came crashing down. Gary was arrested. The weight of the moment was suffocating. The world he had known, the small flat in Glasgow, the quiet nights spent searching for the truth, was gone. He was now in the custody of the authorities, his fate uncertain. The handcuffs were cold against his wrists, a stark reminder of the consequences of his actions. As they led him away, Gary couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. How had it come to this? How had his search for the truth led him here? To this cold, unforgiving reality. As Gary sat in the back of the police car, the world outside seemed to blur. The streets of Glasgow passed by, but he barely noticed. His mind was consumed with thoughts of what lay ahead. The extradition, the trial, the possibility of spending the rest of his life in a U.S. prison. The fear was overwhelming, but there was also a sense of resignation. He had known deep down that this was always a possibility. He had taken a risk, and now he was facing the consequences. But even in that moment of despair, there was a part of Gary that refused to give up. He had wanted to find the truth, to uncover the secrets that he believed were being kept from the world. And even though he was now facing the full weight of the law, he still believed in what he had done. He still believed that the truth was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Gary McKinnon's arrest marked the end of his hacking spree, but it was only the beginning of his battle with the legal system. The chase had come to an end, but the fight for his freedom was just beginning. And as the police car drove away, Gary couldn't help but wonder, would anyone understand why he had done it? Would anyone see him not as a criminal, but as a man who had dared to ask questions that no one else would? The world was watching, and Gary's story was far from over. His search for the truth had led him to this moment, and now he would have to face the consequences of his actions. But one question remained. Was it all worth it? Was the truth he sought worth the price he was now paying? Stay with me as we dive into the next chapter of Gary McKinnon's story, the court battles, the extradition hearings, and the fight for his freedom that would captivate the world and test the limits of justice. This was far from the end. In many ways, it was only the beginning. It was November 2002 when Gary McKinnon truly began to understand the gravity of what lay ahead. Sitting in his lawyer's office, he could almost feel the weight of the indictment pressing down on him. The U.S. federal grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia had indicted him on 7 counts of computer-related crime, each one carrying a potential 10-year prison sentence. The severity of the charges was staggering, 70 years in prison. That was the price the United States wanted him to pay for what they saw as a direct attack on their national security. Gary's lawyer tried to keep him calm, reminding him that they had options, that this was just the beginning of a long legal process. But it was hard to see any light at the end of the tunnel when the consequences were so dire. Gary had always known there would be repercussions, but he had never imagined they would be this extreme. As the media coverage intensified, Gary found himself caught in a whirlwind of public opinion, legal battles, and an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. The following years were marked by an unrelenting cycle of legal proceedings, hearings, and appeals. By June 2005, Gary became subject to bail conditions. He was required to sign in at his local police station every evening and remain at his home address at night. It was a constant reminder that his freedom was hanging by a thread. He couldn't leave the house after dark, couldn't go about his life without the shadow of the legal system looming over him. The press referred to him as a hacker on house arrest, but to Gary, it felt like he was living in a prison of his own making. The days blurred together, and the stress began to eat away at him. Each evening as he signed in at the police station, he was reminded of how close he was to losing everything. Public opinion on Gary's case was divided. On one hand, there were those who saw him as a hero, a man who had dared to expose the vulnerabilities of the world's most powerful military. They viewed him as a whistleblower, someone who was fighting for transparency and truth. On the other hand, there were those who believed he was a reckless criminal, someone who had jeopardized the safety of an entire nation for his own curiosity. Thus debate raged on, and Gary found himself at the center of a battle that was as much about public perception as it was about the law. His face was splashed across newspapers, his story debated on talk shows, and everyone seemed to have an opinion about him. He was no longer just Gary McKinnon. He was now the Pentagon Hacker, a symbol of the growing tension between government secrecy and public transparency. In 2008, the House of Lords rejected Gary's appeal against extradition to the U.S. It was a devastating blow. Gary had hoped that the British legal system would protect him, that they would see the disproportionate nature of the punishment he was facing and decide against sending him to the United States. But that hope was shattered, and the reality of his situation became even more daunting. He was running out of options, and the prospect of being sent to the U.S. to face trial was becoming increasingly likely. The fear of extradition became a constant presence in his life, a shadow that followed him everywhere. He would lie awake at night, his mind racing with thoughts of what awaited him across the Atlantic, an unfamiliar legal system, an unforgiving sentence, and the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. The stress took a toll on Gary's health. He struggled with anxiety and depression, the constant fear of extradition hanging over him like a dark cloud. His lawyers argued that extraditing him to the United States would be a violation of his human rights, given the potential sentence he faced and the fragile state of his mental health. The battle continued, and Gary's supporters rallied around him, launching campaigns, petitions, and public demonstrations to prevent his extradition. The Free Gary movement gained momentum, with supporters arguing that he was being unfairly targeted for exposing the truth. People from around the world sent letters of support, and rallies were held outside government buildings. It was a show of solidarity that gave Gary a glimmer of hope, even as the legal battle raged on. Finally, in October 2012, a glimmer of hope emerged. Then Home Secretary Theresa May blocked Gary's extradition to the United States, citing medical evidence that extradition would pose a high risk to his health. It was a moment of relief that Gary had been waiting for over a decade. He had faced the prospect of losing everything, his freedom, his future, his life. But now, there was a chance that he could finally move on. The news was met with mixed reactions. For Gary's supporters, it was a victory, a triumph of justice over bureaucracy. For those who viewed him as a criminal, it was an outrage, a sign that he had escaped the consequences of his actions. The media frenzy that followed was intense. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and Gary found himself thrust back into the spotlight. But this time, it was different. This time, there was hope. In December 2012, the Director of Public Prosecutions announced that Gary would not face charges in the UK due to the difficulties in bringing a case against him and the likelihood of acquittal. It was the final resolution that Gary had been hoping for. He was free, at least in the legal sense. But the years of legal battles, the stress, the anxiety, the uncertainty, all of it had left a mark on him that could never be erased. He had lost years of his life to the fight, years that he could never get back. The emotional toll was immense, and even though he was no longer facing extradition, the scars of the ordeal remained. The relief was bittersweet. He had his freedom, but at what cost? The impact of Gary McKinnon's actions was significant. U.S. authorities estimated that his activities had caused over $700,000 in damages. The shutdowns, the deleted files, the breaches, they had all taken a toll on the systems he had infiltrated. The U.S. government viewed it as an attack, a direct challenge to their authority, and they were determined to make Gary pay for it. But despite their best efforts, Gary remained in the UK, never extradited, never prosecuted for his actions. The fallout from his hacking spree was far-reaching. It exposed vulnerabilities in some of the most secure networks in the world, leading to changes in cybersecurity protocols and increased scrutiny of government systems. Gary's actions had forced the U.S. government to confront the weaknesses in their own defenses, and in that sense, he had succeeded in his mission. Gary's story is one of defiance, of a man who believed in something so strongly that he was willing to risk everything to find the truth. It is a story of the power of technology, the vulnerability of even the most secure systems, and the consequences of pushing boundaries in the digital age. For some, Gary McKinnon will always be a criminal, a man who broke the law and evaded justice. But for others, he will be remembered as a man who dared to ask questions, to seek answers, and to challenge the status quo. His story became a symbol of the growing conflict between individual freedom and state control, a reminder of the power of one person to challenge the system. Gary had wanted to find the truth, and in doing so, he had exposed just how vulnerable even the most powerful institutions could be. As we look back on Gary's journey, we are left with questions that may never be fully answered. Was it worth it? Was the truth he sought worth the price he paid? And what does his story tell us about the world we live in today? A world where information is power, and those who seek it are both celebrated and condemned. Gary McKinnon may never have found the answers he was looking for, but his story serves as a reminder of the fine line between heroism and criminality, between curiosity and recklessness, and between freedom and the price we are willing to pay for it. His journey was not just about hacking into computer systems. It was about challenging the status quo, about questioning the narratives we are told, and about the pursuit of truth in a world that often prefers to keep it hidden. Gary's battle for freedom may have ended, but the questions his story raises continue to resonate. In a world where governments hold immense power, where secrets are guarded, and where the line between right and wrong is often blurred, Gary McKinnon's story stands as a testament to the power of one individual to make a difference, to challenge authority, and to fight for what they believe in, no matter the cost.